Welcome to Team 1's Unit 8 consulting scenario for the summer semester of LSAL 5283, Building High Performance Teams. This presentation draws from the material covered in this and other MAAL courses and has been prepared by William Edwards, Catherine Foster, Jeffrey Robertson, and Nikolai Talento. The following consulting scenario is based around an interaction between Team 1 consultants and a company called Transcorp, both of which are fictitious entities that have been created for the purposes of this presentation. The following presentation has been prepared by Team 1 consultants for review by the Executive Board of the Transcorp organization. This presentation introduces the core concepts that Team 1 will cover during our upcoming on-site meeting. We strongly believe that the consultant's job is to help their clients achieve their highest potential, but this does not mean solving the client's problems for them. At Team 1, our consulting philosophy mirrors one of our most fundamental lessons about enabling teamwork. Our role is to help our clients create the conditions in which they can thrive. As you will see in this presentation, differences in knowledge and information are one of the key barriers that inhibit teamwork, and we encourage you to develop a working knowledge of this information. As you learn about teamwork and we learn about your organization, the combination of our respective knowledge and skills will be what helped Transcorp build high-performance teams.
Over the past 30 years, rapid technological development and marketplace globalization have drastically changed the nature of work and of leadership. Given the immense complexity of today's workplace, it is no longer practical nor advisable for single leaders to make every decision and dictate every action their subordinates take. As a result, modern leaders must move away from traditional command and control mindsets and learn to empower the collaborative potential of their organizations. We address this new paradigm by reviewing three important facets of teams and their leadership. First, what defines a real team, and what do we commonly get wrong in our assumptions about teamwork? Second, what are the common barriers that teams face, and do these barriers change depending on teams' working conditions? Finally, what are some of the key strategies that organizations can use to develop high-performance teams in any situation?
One issue of particular concern, especially for organizations such as yours, is how teamwork and team leadership differ when teams collaborate in virtual settings versus working in traditional face-to-face settings. Virtual teams do present their own advantages and challenges, but as we will demonstrate, they have more in common with traditional teams than one might assume. Research has shown that virtual teams are just as capable of building interpersonal trust as our face-to-face teams, and the underlying behavioral factors that influence how people interact with one another are present in both types of teams. We assert that virtual and face-to-face teams have more similarities than differences. A helpful way to conceptualize this is through the Hughes, Jeanette, and Surfy's interactional framework model, which asserts that three factors, the leader, the followers, and the situation, all play a role in influencing workplace interactions.
Rather than seeing the leaders and followers in virtual and face-to-face teams as different kinds of people, as shown in this simplistic graphic as red or blue types, we consider them to be the same. What differentiates virtual and face-to-face teams is the nature of their respective situations. In this presentation, we discuss barriers to productive teamwork and strategies for building high-performance teams in general terms first. We then build on these foundations to discuss considerations which are unique to virtual and face-to-face situations. However, before we get to this discussion, we must first consider what the term team really means.
As we move toward talking about creating high-performance teams, we must first talk about the definition of a team. Using the dictionary's definition of team is interesting because it tells us that the word can be used as a noun, a verb, and an adjective. As a noun, it's simply a collection of people associated with a joint action. As a verb, it means to join together. And as an adjective, it describes the type of event taking place as a team, like a team sport or team effort. Based on the definition of team, you might think that teams and groups are the same thing, but in reality, they are quite different. Katzenbach and Smith delineate between the two on several fronts, but their central distinction revolves around the assertion that groups interact as collections of individuals, while teams work collectively towards a shared goal.
Another good description of the difference between groups and teams comes from Hughes, Gennett, and Curfey. They note that both cases are characterized by mutual interaction and reciprocal influence. However, teams go beyond groups in many other areas. Team members have a stronger sense of shared team identity than do members of groups. Teams have common goals and tasks, while group members may not maintain the same sense of shared alignment with respect to goals. Teams typically share a higher degree of task interdependence than groups, and team members are often more task specialized than are group members. For instance, a football team has a quarterback, a kicker, a linebacker, and so on, whereas a group of golfers all perform the same function individually.
Most teams meet together in person to communicate, exchange ideas, work on projects, and complete objectives. These types of teams are referred to as face-to-face teams. When the conditions are optimum, face-to-face teams are likely to be high-performing teams.
Virtual teams meet through the use of technology to communicate and collaborate in lieu of being able to meet in person. The physical boundaries that exist within the virtual teams are bridged through various technological platforms that allow them to communicate mainly verbally and in writing, but in some cases also through video conferencing. Creating the optimal conditions for teamwork in virtual settings is very similar to the requirements of face-to-face teams, but an added focus on communication and knowledge sharing is important. Although face-to-face teams and virtual teams deal with some differences in the ways they communicate, schedule, and organize their collaborations, they are more alike than they are different. They both face similar challenges in creating successful teams, and they both require the use of similar strategies for creating the right environment that allows them to thrive. Whether you are a part of a face-to-face team or a virtual team, the most important factor for success is that the environment you work in is conducive to collaboration and cooperation.
Creating a high-performance team is the ultimate goal when companies bring individuals together to accomplish a mission. But encouraging teamwork is difficult, especially because, as we would discuss in our review of building high-performance teams, leaders cannot order their subordinates to engage in teaming. Individuals must voluntarily conclude that collaboration is the best approach to solving the issues at hand. A collective effort is far and away more likely to produce excellence than individual endeavors. Before we review some of the key strategies that contribute to building high-performance teams, we must acknowledge a number of common barriers that every team is likely to face.
Some barriers are the result of innate human behavioral tendencies and norms. These include the fact that people simply don't always get along. People generally find it easier to stay quiet than to speak up. There's a common fear of authority, and people can have disagreements about the nature of reality. Other barriers, or what might be better termed as boundaries, according to Edmondson, are mainly influenced by the situations teams operate in. These include separation due to physical distance and time, and barriers or boundaries relating to communication, knowledge, status, and culture. In this second group of barriers, because they are more situational, we see more differentiation in the impacts they have on face-to-face and virtual teams. So, we'll begin by quickly reviewing the behavioral barriers that are common across any team.
According to Edmondson, fear of judgment, or what are known as image risks, are some of the most common and compelling issues that individuals deal with when collaborating. These image risks include the fear of being seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, and disruptive. When we look at the first three common behavior barriers, we can see how all of them are influenced by people's perception of image risks. If you're concerned with preserving your image, you're less likely to speak up. You're more likely to defer to people who have more power than you. And if you feel threatened and cannot avoid a disagreement, you will push back. The key to overcoming image risk is by creating what is referred to as psychological safety. And we will cover this topic more in our discussion about building high-performance teams.
Now, a very interesting question is why disagreements occur in the first place. More often than not, they are the result of two people seeing the world differently. And the work of psychologist Lee Ross tells us that there are two common cognitive biases that drive many of these perceptions: naive realism and fundamental attribution error. Naive realism is the belief that you see the world for what it really is, and anyone who disagrees with you must be lacking the information you have. Fundamental attribution error, meanwhile, is the human tendency to overestimate the impact other people's actions have on a situation and discount the role that circumstances play. We like to assign responsibility for outcomes, so we look for people to celebrate or blame, often unfairly. The effects of both naive realism and fundamental attribution error are two factors which influence people's perception of the world around them, also known as their frame. Influencing frames is a key leadership activity that we will also cover in the high performance team section.
Now, let's discuss some of the situational issues that teams may face. As a refresher, the common boundaries we see in this space include separation due to physical distance and time, communication barriers, knowledge barriers, status barriers, and cultural barriers. Physical distance, time, and communication barriers are two issues that are particularly relevant for virtual teams. Physical distance may present the toughest problem, even though technology may allow virtual teams to shrink global differences more than in the past. Edmondson noted that physical distance creates impermeable boundaries, which includes language and time zone differences. It is important that virtual teams enjoy at least some face-to-face time, as well as actively working to ensure they communicate as often as possible while working remotely. However, one advantage that virtual teams have is that a great deal of their communications are written and therefore more formal, which Edmondson notes is key to avoiding misunderstandings.
Both face-to-face and virtual teams should actively try to identify knowledge differences. And this is again a particular concern for virtual teams because they have less opportunity for informal interaction. Another source of knowledge boundaries arise due to different meanings that specialized experts may assign to the same information. When two people from different backgrounds work on the same project, they often do not realize that the other person is operating with different assumptions than they are. This is called implicit knowledge. The taking for granted information that you experience trains you to think it's obvious. The reality is, this information is not obvious to everyone, and it is important for teams to constantly work to expose implicit knowledge. Status barriers are usually the result of organizational or cultural hierarchies. Status barriers may be the most challenging barrier to conquer because when people at the top have the most power and those at the bottom have the least, lower power individuals usually find it hard to speak up. Obviously, status barriers are rooted in the behavioral tendencies discussed earlier. But it is important to note that the role that organizational structures, policies, procedures, and norms play in creating and reinforcing them. Cultural differences, while being an asset because they add diversity to teams, are not without their challenges. Some cultures prefer direct communication to get straight to the point, while others communicate more informally. Cultures also differ in their attitude toward hierarchy and authority, as people from hierarchical cultures may expect to be treated more formally depending on their status. Cultural differences also introduce conflicting norms of decision making, as some make choices quickly while others seek consensus before action.
Both face-to-face and virtual teams must deal with cultural differences within their memberships, but the nature of their situations can have very different impacts in this space. Because face-to-face teams typically work in one location, there tends to be a dominant culture that the team operates within. It is important for leaders of multicultural, face-to-face teams to remember that some of their employees may be adjusting to new norms as they work. Now, consider the impact cultural differences can have on virtual teams. In this case, while there may be a common organizational culture that each employee is familiar with, they are living and experiencing different cultures in their day-to-day lives. Leaders in these situations need to recognize and adjust to the fact that their employees are dealing with these strong local forces and therefore may not adjust to the organization's culture as quickly as they might in a face-to-face team. Now, having introduced you to many issues that teams face, you may be thinking that encouraging teamwork is not worth the effort, and you would be wrong. Let's discuss the key strategies that will help you overcome these barriers and build high-performance teams.
Highest performing teams are those who actively and voluntarily engage in teaming behaviors. The voluntary nature of this teamwork is important because, as we have seen, groups encounter many barriers and it takes a lot of coordinated effort to overcome them and become a team. When teams exist in environments that encourage learning and reward so-called intelligent failures, then the conditions are right for teams to perform at high levels. Edmondson refers to the creation of such an environment as organizing to learn, which is best understood in contrast to the more traditional way of doing business known as organizing to execute. When leaders organize to execute, they send the message that there is one correct way to do things and that compliance is key. When leaders organize to learn, they acknowledge that they do not know everything and that they exist as an interdependent part of the teams which they lead. Organizing to execute is a suitable mindset for highly consistent and controlled situations such as 20th century assembly lines. Meanwhile, organizing to learn helps organizations address the challenges of a complex and dynamic 21st century marketplace. The central question then is, what are the leaders' actions that enable and encourage teaming?
So, how do leaders create the conditions for teamwork? Well, leaders frame situations for learning, create psychological safety, encourage learning from failure, work to span occupational and cultural boundaries, and help their employees work through inevitable conflicts. Now, these actions are both active and passive, meaning that leaders must not only address and encourage different behaviors, but they have to role model those behaviors themselves. The purpose of framing is to ensure that followers adopt a mindset that is conducive to learning. Again, a frame is a frame of reference through which each individual interprets the world around them. Frames can be positive or negative, and the process of framing is both inevitable and implicit. The task of the leader, based on how they communicate about tasks and the behaviors they role model, is to ensure that their followers clearly understand and support their team's goals, their individual roles and responsibilities, and to ensure that each team member feels as though they are allowed to participate fully. First impressions are particularly important in this process, and leaders' virtual teams should be very concerned with setting a good initial tone because they have fewer informal opportunities to influence their teams down the line.
When people feel psychologically safe, they are able to work past their image risk and contribute in ways that are not otherwise possible. Remember that we discussed image risk as part of the common behavioral barriers to teaming in the previous section. To create a sense of psychological safety, it is important that leaders be accessible and approachable, acknowledge the limits of current knowledge, be willing to display fallibility, invite participation, refrain from penalizing good failures, use direct language, set boundaries, and hold people accountable. According to Sinek, great leaders make us feel safe, which leads to feelings of trust, and trust is one of the biggest factors to a successful team. Building up trust in leaders and other team members can help a team reach the safe feeling that allows them to collaborate freely.
When people are aligned to common goals and are experiencing psychological safety, they're ready to learn from their experiences. Good teams, both face-to-face and virtual, use failure as a learning opportunity. They reflect on what they've done, they reflect on what to avoid next time, and they support one another's efforts. And the role that failure plays in team learning varies across what Edmondson calls the process knowledge spectrum. And there are three categories of work within the spectrum. first describes routine operations. These are operations that take place in consistent and high information settings. There are complex operations. There is information about the tasks that happen in complex operations, but there's also a lot of interdependency between tasks, which makes outcomes unpredictable. And finally, there are innovative operations. And these are the operations where people are working at the edge of existing knowledge. 3 types of failures go along with these categories. Preventable failures are those that occur typically in routine operations. Again, knowledge is high, tasks are consistent. These kind of failures should be avoided. Complex failures partner along with complex operations. And usually you see failures in this space due to system breakdowns and that unpredictability. Finally, intelligent failures are those that happen typically in innovative operations and are the result of experimentation. The types of failures that typically occur at each stage help us understand that not every failure is the same. Even though emotionally, organizations tend to view failure as unpleasant and something to avoid, we have to acknowledge that logically, it is unavoidable. It's imperative that leaders understand where their team's tasks sit on the process knowledge spectrum and recognize that treating all failures equally does great harm to a team's willingness to engage in learning activities.
As we saw in the previous section, boundaries typically come in the form of either physical, status-based, or knowledge-based impediments to teamwork. Leaders seeking to overcome their barriers should focus on establishing overarching goals which unify their teams, fostering their team's curiosity, and promoting communication. One example of this is David Kelly's IDEO organization, which brings together non-traditional teams to collaborate on novel problems. IDEO is a great example of an innovative operation where creativity and collaboration are fostered. And in this situation, failures are both expected and rewarded as learnings.
Finally, the last key consideration for leaders who wish to encourage teamwork is to be prepared to manage conflict. Edmondson explores hot conflict and cool conflict, how people react to certain situations and problems. So-called hot people react emotionally, while cool people react slower and more controlled. When conflicts arise, it is the leader's job to cool down the tension by identifying the nature of the conflict, modeling productive communication between the two parties, being thoughtful and mindful when crafting responses and questions, and encouraging hard conversations to explore others' beliefs and values. It is not all about winning the argument. It is sometimes about finding common ground to find a solution for the betterment of the team. Conflict can be a roadblock to effective teaming. However, conflict can be an opportunity to build new understanding, respect, and trust for one another. What separates so-called good and bad conflicts is the extent to which participants direct their energy towards the task at hand or towards one another. Task conflict focuses on differences of opinion towards product or projects, and that is a useful kind of conflict. A relationship conflict, however, is where a person brings emotions and personal friction to the argument, and those must be avoided at all costs. Eisenhart offered the following guidance to ensure that conflict remains task-focused. Focus on the facts, multiply the alternatives, create common goals, use humor, balance the power structure, and seek consensus with qualifications.
It is important to remember that calling a group a team does not make it one. And even the highest performing teams in the most well-intentioned workplaces will face barriers that they must overcome. Ultimately, it is the role of leaders to create the conditions in which their teams can thrive and address these challenges. Through the encouragement of learning-oriented collaborations, organizations maximize the effectiveness of their teams and their organizations as a whole.